Have you ever caught yourself saying, I'm just wired this way? Maybe you've always been the one who overthinks every conversation. Maybe you apologize even when you've done nothing wrong. Maybe asking for help feels almost impossible. Maybe you're constantly preparing for something to go wrong, even when life is going well. Or maybe you've spent your entire life trying to make sure everyone around you is okay, while quietly ignoring yourself. Most of us think these are simply parts of our personality, just who we are. But what if that's not the whole story? What if some of the things that you believe are personality traits are actually solutions? Solutions your brain came up with years ago. Solutions that may have helped you survive one chapter of your life, but are still quietly influencing the chapters that came after. Because every brain is constantly learning, not just facts, rules. If this happens, do that. If people are angry, stay quiet. If you make mistakes, be perfect. If you can't rely on anyone, only rely on yourself. The fascinating part is, most of us never realize we're still living by rules our brains wrote a very long time ago. Today, we're exploring those rules and where they came from, why they stay with us for decades, and what happens when the strategies that once protected us begin getting in the way of the life that we're trying to build. Welcome back to The Human Pattern. I'm Liv. Before we jump in, if you're curious about why people think, feel, and behave the way they do, I'd love for you to subscribe or follow the podcast. And if you find yourself leaving an episode with more questions than answers, then you're exactly where I hope you'll be. So subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss future conversations. And before we begin today, I really want to make one thing clear. I'm not here as a therapist, and this episode isn't meant to diagnose, treat, or replace professional mental health care. My goal is simply to explore what research tells us about human behavior and use that knowledge to better understand ourselves and each other. If today's conversation brings up experiences that feel overwhelming or deeply personal, talking with a qualified mental health professional can be an important part of healing. Trauma is one of those words we hear all the time. It's discussed in books, on social media, in therapy offices, on podcasts, and it's in everyday conversations. But despite how often we use the word, I really think many of us misunderstand what it actually means. I want to explore trauma from a different perspective, not as a diagnosis and not as a label, but as one of the ways our experiences can leave lasting patterns behind. Because once we understand those patterns, we begin to understand ourselves. All right, let's get into it. When we hear the word trauma, our minds tend to rank experiences. We imagine that there's this invisible scale. On one end are the experiences everyone agrees are traumatic: war, violence, natural disasters, serious accidents. And then on the other end are the struggles that we tell ourselves really shouldn't count. My childhood wasn't that bad. Other people have had it much worse. It wasn't abuse. It was just yelling, just criticism, just feeling alone, just never feeling good enough. We become surprisingly good at minimizing our own experiences. Because if someone else had it worse, then maybe we don't have the right to struggle. But our brains just don't work that way. They don't compare your life to someone else's. They don't hand out trophies for who suffered the most. They simply ask one question: did I feel safe? And if the answer is no, then your brain adapts. That's what makes trauma such a fascinating topic. It's really less about creating a category of people who have had trauma, and it's more about understanding how every human brain learns from experiences. Picture two kids growing up in households where arguments happen regularly. In one home, things always get repaired afterwards. Someone explains what happened, offers some reassurance, and really makes sure that the child still feels loved. The fights are stressful, but they happen inside of a container of safety. In the other home, nothing gets resolved. There's no explanation, no comfort, just silence until the next blow up. So it's the same event, but two completely different lessons. The first child's brain learns arguments can happen, and then things get okay again. The second child's brain learns something else entirely. The world is unpredictable. Stay alert because you never know what's coming. That child isn't weaker. Their brain simply received information differently, and it responded exactly the way a good brain is supposed to. It adapted to the world it was actually living in. And that's the part we often miss. Our brains don't simply remember events, they remember the conclusions. They remember the rules that seem necessary in order to survive. Sometimes those rules are incredibly useful, like don't touch a hot stove, look both ways before crossing the street, wear your seatbelt. Lessons like that serve us for life. But emotional lessons are different. They can be perfectly accurate for the environment where we learned them, and then completely unnecessary somewhere else. If a child learns that staying quiet keeps them out of trouble, that strategy might genuinely help them get through their childhood. But 20 years later, that same person may find themselves unable to speak up in a healthy relationship. Not because they're timid and not out of incapability, but because their brain is still running a rule that once made perfect sense. And I think that's one of the most compassionate ways to look at ourselves. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? We can ask, what did my brain learn that made this response feel necessary? One of those questions invites judgment, and the other invites curiosity. And if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you already know which one I'm more interested in. So, if trauma is really about what the brain learns, how does it actually learn those lessons? How does a single experience or years of repeated ones become a pattern that follows us into adulthood? To answer that, we need to look at one of the brain's most remarkable abilities, its ability to adapt. Your brain is doing something extraordinary every moment of every day. It's making predictions. Before you consciously react to a situation, before you've had time to think, your brain is already trying to answer one question: what's about to happen? It does this because prediction is efficient. If your brain can anticipate what's coming, it can prepare you before you even realize there's something to prepare for. And most of the time, that's incredibly helpful. You don't have to relearn that fire is hot every morning. You don't have to consciously remember how to ride a bike every time you get on one. Your brain takes these repeated experiences, finds the pattern, and turns it into something automatic. The more often something happens, the more confident your brain becomes that it knows what's coming next. And that's really how we learn. But here's where it gets interesting. Your brain doesn't only learn from facts, it learns from experience, especially emotional experience. A child spills a glass of milk. In one home, an adult smiles and says, "Let's get this cleaned up together." The child's brain writes that down. Mistakes happen, they're fixable. In another home, the exact same spill is met with anger or shame or a lecture. That brain writes down something else entirely. Not about milk, but about mistakes. This isn't safe. I have to get everything right. Neither child sat down and consciously decided what to believe. Their brain simply noticed what happened and wrote that lesson down, the way they're always doing, quietly, in the background, and with everything that happens to us. Sometimes the lessons are obvious. Sometimes they're so subtle, we never even notice they've been written. Maybe asking for help led to disappointment enough times that you simply stopped asking. Maybe your emotions were met with dismissal often enough that you became the person who automatically says, I'm fine, even when you're not. Maybe love felt unpredictable, warm one day and distant the next, until your brain started scanning for tiny shifts in someone's mood before you even knew you were doing it. None of that means something's wrong with you. It means your brain was paying attention, gathering evidence, trying to answer the same question it's always trying to answer. How do I keep this person safe? And once it thinks it has the answer, it doesn't let it go easily. Because from your brain's perspective, these were never habits, they were survival, even long after the environment that created them is gone. I think that's one of the most incredible things about being human. Our brains don't just remember the past, they carry it forward, not only as memory, but as expectation, as prediction, as an automatic response that can quietly shape the way we move through the world years, even decades later. Most of us can list our personality traits without even thinking twice. I'm a perfectionist. I overthink everything. I hate conflict. I have a hard time trusting people. We say these things like they're written into our DNA, like this is simply who we've always been. But what if some of those things aren't personality traits at all? What if they're survival strategies that have been running so long, they've just started to feel like identity? Let's take perfectionism. People assume it's all about high standards, and sometimes it is. But for a lot of people, perfection was never really about excellence. It was about safety. Mistakes were met with criticism. Getting things right earned praise or attention or simple acceptance. So over time, the brain draws a straight line between the two. If I don't make mistakes, maybe I don't get hurt. The goal was never perfection, the goal was protection. People pleasing works the same way, it's just quieter. On the surface, it looks like kindness, generosity, thoughtfulness, and sometimes it genuinely is. But sometimes it isn't really about making other people happy. It's about making sure they never get angry or disappointed or making sure they never leave. If keeping everyone else comfortable once made your world more predictable, of course that strategy followed you into adulthood because it worked. And then there's that trait that we all admire most, right? Independence. Dependable, capable, self sufficient. We hold these people up as role models. But there's a difference between healthy independence and believing that you can only rely on yourself. For some people, what looks like confidence from the outside is actually self protection on the inside. Somewhere along the way, the brain decided that depending on others was risky and that handling everything alone was just safer. So asking for help doesn't feel uncomfortable, it feels dangerous, not logically, but emotionally, in the body, before the thought ever even fully forms. And finally, hypervigilance, the one most people don't recognize in themselves. Walking in a room and instantly clocking the mood, noticing the tension before anyone says a word, the shift in someone's voice, the flicker across their face. People like to call this observant, and it can be. But for some of us, that radar wasn't built because we wanted it. It was built because at some point, paying that close attention kept us safe. Not a hobby, a survival skill. Here's the part that matters the most. None of these four are inherently bad. Perfectionists build extraordinary things. People pleasers are often the most compassionate people in the room. Independent people get an enormous amount done. The hypervigilant are often the first to notice when someone else is struggling. The strategies aren't broken. They're doing exactly what they were built to do, protecting you. The problem is that they may be protecting you from a danger that isn't there anymore. And I think that's one of the most freeing realizations a person can have. You don't have to hate these parts of yourself or even feel ashamed of them. You can hold both things at once. This probably served me once, and I get to ask whether it's still serving me now. Because awareness isn't about blaming your past, it's about giving yourself the opportunity to choose your future. If you recognize yourself in any of that, you might be thinking, okay, I know I do this, so why can't I just stop? Why can't the perfectionist simply relax? Why can't the people pleaser just say no? Why can't the person who's always scanning the room finally let their shoulders drop? Oh, if only it were that easy. Here's something we don't talk about enough. Understanding a pattern and changing a pattern are two very different things. Think about walking across an open field. The first time, you have to push through tall grass. There's really no clear way through. But if you walk that exact same route every day, eventually a trail starts to form. And after enough time, you stop thinking about where you're going at all. You just follow the path that's already there because it's the path of least resistance. And our mind works the same way. The thoughts that we've repeated, the reactions we've practiced, the expectations we've carried for years, they've become well-worn paths. Not because they're the best route, but because they're the most familiar one. That's why change is so uncomfortable. You're not just trying to think differently. You're trying to step off a path you've walked hundreds, maybe thousands of times. And every new response feels like pushing back through the tall grass again. Slower, less certain, harder. You might know logically that your partner isn't angry, and your stomach still tightens at a short text message. You might know your boss is offering constructive feedback, and it still lands like failure. Knowing the new information doesn't automatically erase the old trail. It just gives you the option, eventually, of choosing a different one. So if you fall back into an old pattern, that doesn't mean that you failed. It means you're human. Change rarely happens all at once. It happens one choice at a time. One of the biggest misconceptions about human behavior is that understanding our past somehow traps us there. I don't see it that way. I think understanding really gives us a choice. Before today, maybe you thought, I'm just an anxious person. I've always been this way. This is just my personality. But maybe those aren't facts. Maybe they're stories. Stories your experiences helped write. Stories that made sense at the time. Stories that protected you and got you this far. The question was never whether those stories were once true. The question is whether they're still true now. Because here's something remarkable about being human. We're not finished. We're still collecting experiences, still meeting people, still changing, still learning. Every healthy relationship teaches us something. Every difficult conversation we survive teaches us something. Every boundary we set, every risk we take, every moment we respond just slightly differently than we did yesterday, it adds another sentence to the story. Researchers call our brain's ability to keep adapting neuroplasticity. I just call it hope because it means the story isn't over. Your past may explain why certain chapters were written, but it doesn't get to write the ending. That part is still being written. This week, I want you to pay attention to one moment where you catch yourself saying, "That's just how I am." When you notice it, pause. Ask yourself one more question. Is this who I am, or is this a pattern that I learned? You might discover that it's genuinely part of your personality. Or you might discover it's a strategy your brain came up with a long time ago. Either answer is okay. Remember, the goal is not to judge yourself. The goal is simply to become curious. And sometimes curiosity is where change begins. One of the things that I love most about studying human behavior is that it changes the questions that we ask ourselves. So instead of "What's wrong with me?" we can begin asking, "What happened that taught my brain to respond this way?" That one shift can change everything because understanding a pattern isn't the same as excusing it. It isn't about blaming our parents or our past or believing that we're powerless. It's about recognizing that our brains are always doing what they believe is most likely to keep us safe. Sometimes they get it exactly right, and sometimes they keep protecting us from dangers that no longer exist. I think there's something incredibly hopeful in that, because if your brain was capable of learning those patterns, it's also capable of learning new ones. Not overnight, not perfectly, but one moment of awareness at a time. And maybe that's what growth really is. Not becoming a completely different person, but becoming someone who understands themselves well enough to choose which patterns to keep and which ones they're finally ready to let go of. Be sure to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening so you don't miss future episodes. And if you're enjoying the human pattern, leaving a rating or a review is one of the best ways to help more curious minds discover the show. And if today's episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. You can find links to the website and social media in the show notes, where we continue these conversations beyond the podcast. Until next time, stay curious, question the pattern, and I'll see you in the next episode.